Hello class. Today we're talking about noob traps. This basically means some strategy, Pokemon, item, or move that new or less experienced players think is great, but is actually quite bad and is probably actively hurting their chances of winning. In my time in the Pokemon community, I've helped thousands of new players improve their teams and or battling skills. On top of being sent thousands of teams and hundreds of replays, I've had conversations with many new players. I've heard them explain why they made a certain play or why they built their team the way they did. So I've seen and I know a lot of the traps that newer players can fall into, and many of them were traps I also fell into when I was new to the competitive scene. In this video, I'll be going over 10 common noob traps. For each noob trap, I'll explain why it appeals to so many newer players and why it's actually terrible. The examples I give will mostly be from the Scarlet and Violet Overused tier, the main format for competitive singles, but a lot of these noob traps ensnare players across many formats. The first noob trap is an item, the Blunder Policy. It's a simple item. If the holder misses an attack, you get a +2 speed boost. Now, there are exceptions. If you put a Blunder Policy on, say, a Weavile and only hit the first 2 hits of Triple Axle but miss the third, the Blunder Policy won't activate. Or if you attack a Dragapult that's in the middle of using Phantom Force, that also won't activate it. But in most circumstances, if you miss a move, you get +2 speed, so double speed if you didn't have any stat changes before. This sounds like a pretty solid item. Speed is rightfully considered the most important stat in the game. Doubling it is a huge deal. It also seems like a bit of a safety net. It sucks to miss a move, but this puts a positive spin on that. Newer players in particular tend to absolutely hate missing moves because they're not adept enough to manage their odds and play in a way that avoids having to use inaccurate moves. So having an item that helps you out with this is very appealing. It also emboldens the builder to put more inaccurate moves on that Pokemon. The Blunder Policy is often paired with extremely powerful but inaccurate moves like Zap Cannon or Inferno. Inferno is what I'm using on my Chandelure in the background footage. It's a 100 base power special fire move that always burns when it hits, but it has a horrible 50% accuracy. This kind of power attracts new players, but even those with very little experience realize that 50% accuracy is terrible. The Blunder Policy, though, gives a way to justify these insanely powerful moves. But this item is fundamentally flawed. It almost never really works. The biggest issue is that you can't control when you miss or hit. You might really need a speed boost and hope you miss, but then you hit. You might have already activated the Blunder Policy, or you just really need to hit what's in front of you, and then you miss. Secondly, the moves you have to run to make the Blunder Policy worthwhile are simply bad moves. There's a reason nobody is using Zap Cannon or Inferno. 50% accuracy is just awful to deal with, and the speed boost isn't nearly enough to compensate for wasting a move slot on this. You might say, well, I'm not using Zap Cannon or Inferno, I'm using Focus Blast. That's 70% accurate, so it's not as bad, right? And yes, that's true, it's not as bad of a move, but then that makes the Blunder Policy less worthwhile, less likely to activate. Whichever direction you go, more or less accurate, the item still isn't a good idea. Third, consider the kind of Pokemon that would use a Blunder Policy. Blissey doesn't care about double speed. Rillaboom would like it, sure, but not enough to use a Blunder Policy. It's not these defensive or balanced Pokemon that are using it. The Pokemon that are actually using this item are almost always offensive sweepers. These are Pokemon that can't afford a single miss. If you run Zap Cannon on a Registeel and you miss, no big deal. You can try again later. If you miss your Zap Cannon with your frail Porygon Z, you're in serious trouble. There is no later. You probably can only survive 1 or 2 hits. All of the Pokemon that can afford to run extremely inaccurate moves aren't the Pokemon that would ever want to use a Blunder Policy. It's a fun item to mess around with, and it can get some sweeps if you get lucky, but it's generally not a real competitive item. There may be some niche use for it somewhere that I'm not aware of, but I doubt it. If you have a Pokemon with a Blunder Policy on your team, I suggest you rethink that set. The second noob trap also deals with accuracy, but in a much different way. This noob trap is also an item, the Wide Lens. This boosts the holder's accuracy by 1.1 times, or 10%, and it's important to note that the 10% boost to accuracy is a percentage based on the original accuracy. So if you give a Focus Blast Pokemon the Wide Lens, you do not have an 80% accurate Focus Blast, you have a 77% accurate Focus Blast. This means more accurate moves get a more significant accuracy boost. This item isn't a noob trap in the same way as the Blunder Policy. You can see why the Blunder Policy is attractive, but the wide lens seems confusing at first. It doesn't offer any power boost or really do anything significant. It's not a flashy item. But a lot of new players end up using this after they're frustrated by missing moves. Sometimes this will be to give a small boost to moves like Focus Blast, but more commonly I see it used with 90% accurate moves. A new player may give a wide lens to their Cinderace after losing a game to missing a Pyro Ball or worse, a high jump kick, both 90% accurate moves. With the wide lens, both of these moves are 99% accurate. They'll almost never miss. And this seems pretty good. You can turn your Cinderace into an extremely reliable Pokemon that you can count on to hit every time. The problem is that it's ultimately just never worth the opportunity cost. By using the wide lens, you're giving up an item slot that could be used on something else, something way more significant. In the case of Cinderace, you could be using heavy-duty boots. Hazard damage is a huge deal for Cinderace, especially if using a court change set to reverse hazards. It's not just Cinderace though. If you're using a wide lens on your Latios to always hit Draco Meteor, that could be a Soul Dew, that could be a Choice Specs. Sure, hitting with wide lens is better than missing with choice specs on a single turn, but long term, the non-wide lens item will always be better. The better solution to managing inaccurate moves is just playing in a way that minimizes the need to use those inaccurate moves, but this is a more advanced skill. A lot of newer players don't factor in the mischance to their thought process at all. They simply play assuming every move will hit, and often get very frustrated when misses occur. They'll blame bad RNG rather than the fact that they used 6 Pyro Balls in a game where they only really needed to use 2. It's very understandable to get frustrated by unfortunate misses, but if you're using a wide lens, I'd encourage you, take it off, try a stronger item, accept the occasional misses, and let yourself learn how to manage and play around those odds. Now, a quick disclaimer, there is one Pokemon that should be using the wide lens, and that is Mousehold. Population Bomb is a 10-hit move. Each hit is 90% accurate, and the move ends when one of those hits misses. The odds of getting all 10 hits is 34.9%, or 0.9 to the power of 10. But with a wide lens, each hit becomes 99% accurate. Suddenly your odds are 90.4% to hit all 10 hits. That's nearly triple the accuracy. Mousehold is the singular exception that I'm aware of, though. Triple Axle works in a similar way to Population Bomb, but wide lens Triple Axle is largely outclassed by Loaded Dice Icicle Spear since it doesn't make contact. The next noob trap isn't an item, but rather a concept. It's the idea that you always need to set up with your sweepers before attacking. On this team, I'm running a Shell Smash Cloyster and a Dragon Dance Dragonite, and most of the time when they enter the field, the first move I click is that setup move. It makes sense why. If you set up immediately, every following attack you use is more powerful. If you attack a bit first, then set up, then attack more, you spent all of those turns weaker and still ended up having to burn a turn on setup anyway. And this is a good argument. As I said, I usually click the setup move right away. The problem is that I usually click the setup move right away, whereas a lot of less experienced players always click the setup move right away. It becomes a habit for them. There are a lot of times, though, where you don't want to set up immediately. Maybe my Dragonite can KO something in front of me with extreme speed before I attempt to set up. If the Pokemon in front of me can deal a lot of damage, I'd rather set up on something more favorable. Maybe my sweeper can't sweep just yet. I need to hit my opponent's switch in once, swap my sweeper out, and try again later. Or maybe setup is just straight up unnecessary. Maybe your sweeper already wins without any stat boosts. I've had opponents throw games against me because they wanted to boost their stats and they risked a critical hit or some secondary effect that was totally unnecessary. All they had to do was attack and win. If this sounds like you, what you need to do is just be more aware of the game. Don't turn off your brain when you bring in your sweeper. Ask yourself if the boosting move is actually necessary. Often it is the best play, but sometimes it isn't, and that can be the difference between a win or a loss. The next noob trap is an item, and in fact, it's another lens, the scope lens. In particular, focus energy plus the scope lens. The scope lens boosts the holder's critical hit ratio by 1 stage. Focus energy is a move that raises the user's critical hit ratio by 2 stages, and critical hit boosting works differently than boosting other stats. Plus 0 is 1 in 24, the standard critical hit chance. Plus 1 is 1/8, this is the critical hit chance of a Pokemon holding the scope lens or just high critical hit moves like Stone Edge. +2 critical hit ratio is 1/2, a 50% chance to get a critical hit, and +3 is 100%. If you reach +3 critical hit ratio, every single move will get a critical hit. So any Pokemon holding a scope lens that uses focus energy will get a critical hit every single time, +1 from scope lens and +2 from focus energy. It ignores the stat drops that your Pokemon has and the stat boosts of your opponent, but most importantly of all, it deals 1.5 times more damage than a regular move. To a lot of less experienced players, this sounds amazing. A critical hit every single turn? Those are normally 1 in 24, pretty rare, and with just an item and one turn, you can get it every single time. And there's more. You can utilize this alongside powerful moves like Draco Meteor and Overheat that lower special attack after being used. Since critical hits will ignore your stat drops, you can keep spamming powerful Draco Meteors over and over again, getting critical hits and never worrying about the special attack drop. This sounds great, but it's almost never worth it. The first issue is that 1.5 times is actually quite a poor boost. Critical hits sound really nice and special, but oftentimes their only real effect is just acting like a +1 boost, equivalent to setup move like Work Up, Howl, or Charge Beam. These moves are almost never used for a reason. Now, of course, as stated, the critical hit has other benefits, but it's still not a massive power boost. Secondly, almost every Pokemon that gets focus energy also learns a much better boosting move. Ogerpon gets Swords Dance, Hydreigon gets Nasty Plot, Blaziken gets Swords Dance. These are all Pokemon that I've seen running focus energy. These are +2 boosting moves, which almost always vastly outweigh the benefits of critical hits. It will be stronger in almost every scenario to use Swords Dance or Nasty Plot instead. The main counter-argument to this is that using Scope Lens plus Focus Energy alongside moves like Draco Meteor and Overheat definitely does deal more damage if used repeatedly than if that Pokemon used Nasty Plot and just lost the stat boost right after attacking for the first time. This still isn't worth it though. Look at Hydreigon for example. In what scenario is Hydreigon actually spamming Draco Meteor over and over in a game, even with constant critical hits? Probably you're either bombarding a defensive Pokemon as it attempts to heal, or your opponent is just so weak to Hydreigon that they're getting destroyed by Draco Meteor spam. If it's a defensive Pokemon, then you'd probably rather have Nasty Plot in that scenario, to threaten to grow your power to much higher levels than the critical hit can offer. And if your opponent's team is just getting ruined by Draco Meteor spam, well, you can probably win the game just by clicking Draco Meteor, then switching Hydreigon out and back in again. The idea of clicking powerful moves like Draco Meteor and Overheat over and over without it ever getting weaker sounds great, but in actual games this will hardly ever happen. And of course, it takes up an item slot. All that Scope Lens does is increase the chance of you getting that 1.5 times boost, that critical hit. Not a great deal when there are items like Choice Specs, Life Orb, Leftovers, Heavy Duty Boots. The opportunity cost is huge. Now, there are some exceptions to this. The ability Sniper gives critical hits another 1.5 times multiplier for a 2.25 times total critical hit multiplier. This is a larger boost than Nasty Plot or Swords Dance would provide. Now, the Scope Lens still takes up an item slot, so if a Sniper Pokemon gets Swords Dance or Nasty Plot, it may often still use that instead of Focus Energy. But a lot of Sniper Pokemon don't get other boosting moves. Kingdra has no way to boost its special attack, and it has Sniper, and it gets Stab Draco Meteor, so there are a lot of factors that make Kingdra a special exception. Blaziken is another possible exception. It sometimes enjoys spamming critical hit overheats, and it doesn't get Nasty Plot or any other way to boost a special attack. These sets are probably outclassed by Swords Dance variants, but you could justify using it. I also want to acknowledge that the Scope Lens is a valid item on some Pokemon that get a lot of high critical hit moves. Gallade sometimes runs it in lower tiers, for example. The Scope Lens plus high crit moves gets you to a 50% chance, which is pretty solid. Generally though, if you're using a Scope Lens or Focus Energy or both, you're probably not using it right. Try a more conventional setup move, put on a more powerful item, and watch your results dramatically improve. The next noob trap is just gimmicks in general. Newer players tend to gravitate to extremely cheesy strategies. It's hard to define exactly what constitutes a gimmick, but you probably have a good idea in mind. Gimmick teams are teams that use some kind of unusual strategy to get a win in an unconventional way, and they often fall apart if your opponent knows what you're up to. They're also usually extremely matchup dependent and are often played the same way nearly every game. What I'm using in the background footage is Shell Smash Eject Pack Torkoal. You use Shell Smash, the defense drop pivots Torkoal out, and then some Pokemon like Espeon or Flamigo uses Copycat, copies the Shell Smash, and tries to sweep. Level 1 Endeavor Pokemon are also very gimmicky. Reverse Toxic Spikes with Guts Pokemon is another gimmick. There are countless strategies out there like this. New players tend to love gimmicks for several reasons. First of all, some of the most popular Pokemon videos on YouTube utilize gimmicks. Temp6t's channel is a great example of this. He has dozens of videos with over 1 million views each, showcasing gimmick strategies beating teams of legendaries. That's enough to make a lot of players try gimmicks, but the reason they keep using gimmicks is that it works well for them. Gimmicky teams often play the exact same way every game. If you have a good matchup or your opponent doesn't know the strategy, you'll probably win, and vice versa. But you really don't need to think. You can play it almost the same way every time. To look again at this Shell Smash Torkoal example, if my opponent doesn't know what I'm up to, I'm going to Shell Smash, eject back out, try to copycat, and try to sweep. What if my opponent does know? Well, I do the same thing. That's all I really can do. These gimmick strategies are, without exception, terrible at all levels of play. But if you don't have the skill to play a more conventional team, these gimmicks might perform better for you than anything else. Maybe you win 1 in 5 games, or 0 in 5 games with any other team, but 2 or 3 in 5 games with this gimmick strategy. The problem is that you can't effectively learn while using a lot of these gimmicks. You essentially become a bot, clicking almost the same buttons in almost the same order every game. You don't develop the skills that you need to advance. Now, if you find gimmicks fun, and that's just how you like to play the game, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if your goal is to improve and learn, it's time to leave the gimmicks behind. It may initially lead to worse results, but long-term it will definitely make you a stronger player. The next noob trap is another item, the room service. And much like real-life room service, you're getting a bad deal. This item lowers the holder's speed by 1 stage when Trick Room is active, and it's consumable. It only does this once. This item isn't used much, but it's still used way too often. First of all, some think that this item extends Trick Room to 8 turns, like a terrain extender would do for terrain. It doesn't. It just lowers your speed when Trick Room is active. But even this small effect appealed to many people. It opened the door for Pokemon that were too fast to effectively take advantage of Trick Room in the past to suddenly become abusers. Or at least so some thought. In reality, this item is almost never worth it. The opportunity cost is just much too high. That Trick Room abuser could be running a Choice Band, Life Orb, all kinds of items that boost its power a ton. Is it worth giving up an item slot just to be faster than a few Pokemon in Trick Room? Generally, no. It also just hardly ever makes sense to need to slow a Pokemon down. The best Trick Room abusers have horrible speed, and their other stats are often very good to compensate for this. If a Pokemon is so fast that you feel the need to give it a room service, it probably doesn't have the stats in other areas that justify it having a slot on your Trick Room team, especially since it's now basically itemless. And if you are truly sure that you want to slow down a fast Pokemon, the Iron Ball halves speed, and it's not even one-time use, so it's probably superior for your purposes. The only real use for the room service is when you want a Pokemon to outspeed certain Pokemon outside of Trick Room and in Trick Room. In the context of singles, this really isn't ever worthwhile. In doubles, where Trick Room is much more common, this can be worth it in some very rare cases. Wolfglick used this on a Pelipper to outspeed certain threats both outside and under Trick Room. You could also argue Hoopa Unbound is one exception to this. Its ability Magician steals items from the opponent, so on a Trick Room team it might want a consumable item. Even this I doubt though. Generally, if you're using the room service, especially in singles, I suggest you try basically any other item. I think things will go better for you. The next noob trap isn't a particular item, it's the concept of lures. Much like a fishing lure, the idea behind a lure in competitive Pokemon is to catch someone off guard, often getting a surprise KO with an unusual set. One example of a lure I'm using is on this team, Choice Specs Power Gem Meowscarada. My Grass Spam team does not enjoy facing Moltres, and Moltres is a very common switch into Meowscarada, so by running Power Gem, I could catch an unsuspecting Moltres and one-hit KO it. Pretty cool, right? Then my Grass Spam team is free to destroy. It's no wonder why a lot of newer players like strategies like this. It sounds good in theory, and it's very flashy. These are the kinds of clips that get posted on YouTube Shorts or TikTok, the massive surprise KOs that nobody saw coming. In reality though, lures are almost always a bad idea. For starters, consider why your opponent was lured in the first place. It's because they didn't expect your set. Why didn't they expect your set? It's because almost nobody is using that set. And why is almost nobody using that set? It's because that set is bad. Not bad when it works, obviously, but how often will it work? If it was a consistent or strong strategy, it would get higher usage and cease to be an effective lure. It might work out when you see the target Pokemon or target group of Pokemon, but there will be tons of games where you don't see the things you're trying to lure. And even if you do see them, so much can go wrong. For example, switching in Moltres on Meowscarada is such an obvious play that your opponent might predict you won't stay in, maybe fearing Flame Body. They might think you're trying to bait their Moltres onto the field and not go into it, even completely not knowing you have Power Gem. And if you click Power Gem on something that's not Moltres, the jig is up. Now they know you're set, and since it's probably a pretty bad set you're running, they can deal with it quite easily. Your opponent also might know before you even reveal it. Nobody has time to build a new team for every game. If you've used this team before, or someone sent the team to you, you never know who might already know about your secret. There are a million ways a lure can go wrong, and only one way it can go right. The problem is that players are more likely to remember the one time that it did go right. Hitting a Moltres with Power Gem is a highlight reel moment. All of those games where Meowscarada just kind of sucked and didn't do very much don't stick out in the memory. So if you find yourself often using lures in your team building, try paying attention to how often they actually work. Also, test out a different, more consistent set, and I think you'll see much better results. Now, using unconventional sets is a great idea and can surprise your opponent, but the purpose shouldn't be to lure and KO a specific Pokemon. It should just be a set that's generally good and underrated. This next noob trap is pretty simple, an obsession with super effective hits. Super effective hits are obviously great. A 2x multiplier is a huge deal. Oftentimes, if you can hit your target super effectively, you should, but not always. Super effective hits are exactly a 2x multiplier. No more and no less. Suppose your Iron Moth is trying to deal as much damage as possible to Ting Lu before Earthquake KOs it next turn, and you have both Overheat and Dazzling Gleam as options. Which does more? A lot of newer players would default to Dazzling Gleam because it's super effective, but let's do the math. Overheat is 130 base power, and it gets a 1.5x multiplier for stab since Iron Moth is a fire type. This gives it a final power of 195 here. Dazzling Gleam is 80 base power, and it gets a 2x boost for being super effective, giving it a final power of 160. Overheat is stronger, and it's not particularly close. I've seen so many players lose games because they clicked the super effective option instead of the option that actually did more damage. If you're not sure what to click, just do this quick mental math or use an automatic damage calc extension. I'll link one in the description. This obsession with super effective hits isn't just a battling problem though, it's also hurting newer players in the team builder. For example, Liquidation on Swords Dance Garchomp. Assume you're using a Swords Dance loaded dice scale shot set. If you want to hit a ground type, Liquidation will be super effective, so that's 85 times 2 for 170 power. Scale shot, even with only 4 hits, is 100 base power, and with the stab multiplier, that's 150, only slightly weaker. And if you get 5 hits, it's 187.5. Now, still, Liquidation does have some benefits. It can't miss, and it's still stronger on average than Scale Shot against, say, a Landorus or Gliscor. But is it worth being a tiny bit stronger? You could use a move slot on Substitute to avoid Kingambit's Sucker Punch, or Fire Fang to hit Corviknight, something that Scale Shot actually can't do much damage to. When team building, before you add some unusual coverage option, consider if it's actually worthwhile when one of your stronger stabs might be better in almost every scenario. The next noob trap is also a concept, the idea that you can't have overlapping types in team building. So many newer players think that if you put 2 dark types on when you start the team, or 2 ground types, or 2 water types, that it's the end of the world, that it's unacceptable. Some even go so far as to avoid a single overlapping type in their entire team. Others have a less strict but still unnecessary rule of avoiding any more than 2 of the same type across their entire team. And this makes sense. Types are the main thing that almost all players know and understand when they get into the competitive scene. And team building is incredibly complicated. It takes years of practice to understand what makes a good team, what corners can be cut and which cannot, and how to spot what will work and won't work well in a battle. Conversely, it's very easy to look at the types on your team and make sure you balance them. Not too much of this type, not too much of that type, make sure there's a fire, grass, water core, that kind of thing. The truth is that this approach is often just wrong. Overlapping types is not only okay, it's often a good idea. Running 2 or 3 dark types, for example, puts a lot of pressure on your opponent's dark resists, and the earlier dark types can wear down those resists, enabling the other dark types to sweep or deal massive damage. Overlapping types on the defensive side is not as beneficial, but still not necessarily a problem. When you're team building, don't worry about what your type weaknesses are until 3 Pokemon are down. And don't worry about overlapping types too much either. I'd say 3 of the same type is probably okay, of course, depending on that type. If it's Ice or Bug, you may want to rethink that. 4 of the same type isn't always a problem, but it's usually a problem, so be careful there. And 5 or 6 of the same type is almost certainly an issue. This is for singles, my area of expertise, but doubles won't be too far off. Type diversity is a bit more important in doubles to avoid giving your opponent easy choices against your team, but still, many strong teams in the current Pokemon Champions meta use 2 of the same type. So if you're panicking about type cores and weaknesses when you've got only 2 Pokemon in the builder, relax. You should have major weaknesses with so few Pokemon on the team. Focus more on creating an offensive core that will threaten your opponent and less on unhelpful generalizations about the type chart. I guarantee this will lead to better teams. The last noob trap we'll be going over today is also related to team building. It's the idea that you need a hard counter or a dedicated counter for every threat. With so many threatening Pokemon in the tier, it's impossible to have an easy switch in to every Pokemon. Even stall teams, which just have 6 defensive Pokemon, don't have an answer for everything. And as I said, team building is extremely challenging, so new players often find themselves scrambling to patch holes in a team only to create more problems. That's because they're usually looking to match one threat with one counter. Take Choice Specs Kyurem, for example. What actually answers this monster? Well, there's Bronzong. Being a steel type with Levitate, it shuts down Kyurem very well. There's also Blissey. It has such an incredible special defense and HP stat that it's basically a hard counter to every special attacker, at least in theory. I see a ton of newer players slap Blissey onto teams where it doesn't belong, and I suspect this is why. But is there anything other than Blissey and Bronzong to answer Kyurem? Not really. So does this mean you should run a Blissey or Bronzong on every team? Of course not. There's a better way of handling threats that many newer players overlook. You can have several Pokemon that together counter a threat. Take especially defensive Galarian Slowking. This alone is not an answer to Choice Specs Kyurem. It gets 2-hit KO'd by Earth Power and Blizzard, and gets ruined by Ice Beam and Draco Meteor if Kyurem terras into that type. A lot of new players would say, okay, so this isn't an answer, I need to look somewhere else to stop Kyurem. But hold on, Galarian Slowking has Regenerator, which heals it upon switching, so it can at least switch in, survive one hit, and see what Kyurem locks itself into. If you have, say, a Corviknight and a Heatran alongside your Galarian Slowking, now you're all set. If the Kyurem locks itself into Earth Power, you can go into Corviknight. If it locks itself into an Ice move, you go into Heatran, and either Steel type can handle Draco Meteor. Individually, these Pokemon aren't Kyurem answers, but together they are. Good team building almost always involves spreading the answer for a certain threat out among 2 or more Pokemon. Now, I'm certainly not expecting anyone, particularly less experienced players, to be able to spot these combinations of Pokemon that can handle threats. What I suggest is that if you notice a threat when team building and there are few or no easy answers, consider Pokemon that may help with the threat, even if they don't hard counter it. See if any of those Pokemon fit well into your build, and then look for others that also help with that threat and also continue fitting in with your team. This will often lead to a core that can handle the threat. That's not to say you shouldn't ever have hard counters. If your team is weak to Ogerpon Wellspring and you add a physically defensive Hydrapple, that very well may be a good idea. But you definitely won't have hard counters for every Pokemon, and it's going to really hurt your team building if you try. I should also mention that another way to deal with these major threats is offensive pressure. If your team is offensive enough, you can prevent powerful breakers from ever getting a good opportunity to attack. Sort of a good offense is the best defense kind of philosophy. Maybe nothing on your team can comfortably switch into Pecharunt's Malignant Chain, but if your team has 4 powerful special attackers that can outspeed and one-hit KO Pecharunt, that may not be a problem. Offensive teams also tend to be more okay with letting a Pokemon get KO'd, so if you find yourself in a difficult situation with a very offensive team, letting the least valuable member die is a solid option. Those are the 10 major noob traps for this video. This is actually a part 2. If you want to check out my first video on noob traps, that will be linked in the description. If there are any more noob traps you want me to discuss that weren't covered in this video, please let me know in the comments. If there are enough and I feel they're significant and common, I might make a part 3. Also, if you have any questions about building or battling, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. I'll do my best to answer them all. Before I end this video, I want to clarify that creativity and exploring underrated strategies is a good idea. Not only is it one of the most fun parts of the competitive scene, but it also produces some of the strongest teams and strategies. The point of this video certainly isn't to discourage creativity. It's to inform you of the things that might be holding you back so you can discover those things that are truly underrated, rather than getting stuck in compelling traps that lead nowhere. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. Well, that's it. Class dismissed.